The captured German colonel stood motionless as his eyes scanned the vast yard before him. Wooden crates stretched in endless rows, each carefully marked with stenciled numbers. Heavy trucks waited with engines idling, their steel frames glinting in the pale light of the late afternoon. Aircraft parts lay in orderly piles, while young American soldiers moved briskly among them, unhurried yet efficient. For a long moment, the colonel said nothing. Then, as if speaking only to himself, he whispered a truth that chilled him deeper than captivity itself. This war is lost. Welcome, dear listener. Tell me in the comments where and when you are listening tonight. If these stories bring you comfort, please subscribe to support the channel. Now, let us begin. The colonel's journey into captivity had been quiet, almost too quiet for a man accustomed to the thunder of artillery and the cries of men. The world around him seemed muffled, as though wrapped in a heavy cloth that dulled both sound and color. He sat inside the back of a military truck, wrists resting loosely on his knees, guarded but not mistreated. Through the open canvas flap, he could see stretches of road unfolding into the distance, the occasional farmhouse and lines of American vehicles moving in steady rhythm. What struck him first was not fear, but an absence of it. In German reports, American soldiers had been painted as clumsy, soft, lacking discipline, yet the men he glimpsed from his seat carried themselves with a quiet assurance. Their uniforms were well kept, their weapons polished, their boots sturdy. They did not bark orders at each other, nor did they seem hurried. They moved as though the war, with all its chaos, had not unsettled them. For the colonel, whose own forces had long been stretched to breaking point, the contrast was unsettling. The ride was long, punctuated by the low growl of the engine. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, mingled with the earthy scent of autumn fields. His thoughts wandered back to Germany, to barracks where food had grown scarce, where fuel was measured carefully, where officers like him spoke loudly of victory, even as their voices trembled in private. He thought of the speeches he had given to younger officers, insisting that sacrifice would bring triumph. Yet here he sat, watching convoys of American supplies roll past, convoys longer than anything he had ever seen in his homeland. At a crossroads, the truck slowed. He leaned slightly to see better. Ahead stretched a column of vehicles, trucks piled high with crates, jeeps with radios mounted, even a fuel tanker painted in dark olive. The line of motion seemed endless. It was not hurried, nor did it appear strained. Each vehicle followed another with practiced ease. He noted the tires, thick, unworn, well supplied. He saw faces of drivers, young men chewing gum, one humming softly as though on an afternoon drive rather than moving into war. The colonel felt a tightening in his chest. In Germany, such abundance no longer existed. Tires were patched again and again. Fuel was guarded like treasure. Even simple things, soap, clean cloth, shoes, were rationed and often unobtainable. Here, he saw none of that desperation. What he witnessed was not only supply, but continuity, as if a vast machine stretched across an ocean, feeding these roads with more than could ever be consumed. The convoy moved aside to let their truck pass. He met the gaze of one American driver, a boy no older than 20, who smiled faintly before returning his attention to the wheel. That brief glance carried with it something the colonel could not ignore: confidence, as though the outcome of this war was already known. Hours later, when the truck finally slowed to a stop, the colonel was escorted out. His boots struck gravel. The air was cooler now, tinged with the metallic scent of machinery. He straightened his uniform as much from habit as from pride. Around him stretched a yard unlike any he had imagined. Crates, hundreds of them, stacked in neat rows. Vehicles, freshly painted, lined up as though for inspection. Beyond them, the silhouettes of warehouses loomed against the dimming sky. For a moment he felt dizzy, overwhelmed not by his own capture, but by the sheer scale of what surrounded him. He tried to measure it, to imagine the numbers. How many rifles within those crates? How many uniforms folded inside? How many meals ready to be eaten? Yet the attempt faltered. The mind, trained to calculate, could not encompass it. His world had been one of scarcity, of stretching each resource until it nearly broke. Here, resources seemed to flow without end. The guard beside him gave a nod, a gesture neither harsh nor kind, and motioned him forward. As they walked between towering stacks of supplies, the colonel felt smaller with each step. He thought of German propaganda that had promised America was weak, distracted, too divided to fight a long war. He had believed it because belief was easier than doubt. But now, in this silent yard, belief crumbled. One detail lingered in his memory long after, the faint sound of a train approaching. He turned his head and saw smoke rising in the distance, the low rumble growing stronger. Another delivery was coming in, another flood of materials into this place, already overflowing. For the first time, he lowered his eyes. A whisper formed on his lips, though he would never admit it to his captors. "We cannot win." That whisper hung in the air, unfinished, as the hiss of train brakes drew nearer. The hiss of the train brakes lingered like steam on the air, curling against the cool evening as the colonel turned his head. It was not the sound alone that unsettled him, but the meaning carried with it. From beyond the low ridge came the steady chug of locomotives, wheels grinding on iron rails, a rhythm too confident, too constant to be chance. He had heard trains often in his life, in Berlin, in Munich, in garrison towns, but this one spoke a different language. It was not the hurried, sputtering arrival of a nation stretched thin. It was not the faltering breath of a system breaking under weight. It was the sound of continuity, of one delivery among countless others, a small part of a stream so wide it could never run dry. He watched as the train came into view, long boxcars rattling behind the engine. Painted markings gleamed faintly under lanterns. Men in work clothes moved quickly along the platform as though rehearsed 1,000 times. With practiced hands, they swung open doors, hauled down crates, stacked them with a precision that bordered on ritual. The colonel's eyes followed the movement. Rifles, machine parts, sacks of grain, tins of food, barrels of fuel. He recognized them all at once, yet together they became something greater. A flood of necessity turned into surplus. For a moment he closed his eyes, recalling Germany's own railways. He saw in his memory the shattered tracks after bombing raids, trains halted in tunnels, cargo left abandoned. He thought of fuel shortages that left trains motionless in sidings, of the angry faces of civilians waiting for supplies that never came. And now, before him, was the opposite vision. Steel flowing like water, uninterrupted, with men untroubled by scarcity. He felt it in his chest like a weight. The colonel's education had included logistics. He had studied numbers, charts, and the fine art of moving men and materials across continents. Germany had once prided itself on efficiency, on rail timetables that synchronized with the ticking of watches, but war had worn it thin, had bent the timetables into broken lines. In front of him now was something larger than efficiency. It was abundance. It was the knowledge that if one train failed, 10 more would follow, and if 10 fell, 100 waited. He whispered nothing this time, for words seemed useless against the noise of iron on iron. A soldier beside him shifted his rifle and looked at the train with casual indifference. For the Americans, this was not spectacle. It was routine. That indifference struck the colonel more deeply than the sight itself. To witness greatness as ordinary was more terrifying than to see it announced. To these men, the endless arrival of supplies was not a marvel, not a miracle, but the expected order of things. He thought of propaganda back home. Posters that had depicted Americans as weak, spoiled by luxury, incapable of sacrifice. He had delivered lectures repeating those claims, his voice firm, his face stern before younger men. He had spoken of Germany's discipline, of strength through struggle, of destiny. But how shallow those words felt now, as he stood before a train that spoke more truth in one arrival than 100 speeches. The air grew thick with the scent of coal smoke and oil. Wooden crates thudded as they landed, marked with stenciled codes. One box cracked slightly, revealing glints of metal, rifle barrels shining, untouched by rust. The colonel thought of German soldiers at the front, cleaning and reusing weapons that had passed through too many hands, patching stocks with bits of wire, carrying ammunition counted too carefully. Here, barrels gleamed in surplus, ready to be lifted, carried, and distributed as though they weighed nothing at all. Further down the platform, he caught sight of food supplies being unloaded, boxes of canned meat, sacks of flour, even crates of coffee. The scent of roasted beans drifted faintly into the air. For the colonel, that smell was like a ghost from another life, one almost forgotten. Coffee had become a memory in Germany, replaced by bitter substitutes. To smell it now, rich and unashamed, was to feel how far his homeland had fallen. He wondered how many such trains crossed this continent each day. The thought expanded until it dwarfed him. He had read reports of American factories, of production figures that seemed exaggerated, inflated by enemy lies. Tanks produced by the thousands, aircraft rolling from hangars daily, ships launched as if from an endless mold. He had dismissed them as impossible. Now, as one train's cargo spilled into this yard already filled beyond reason, he could no longer dismiss. The sun dipped lower, the sky shifting into deep shades of violet. Lanterns glowed, swinging slightly as men moved. The colonel's gaze drifted upward to the power lines stretched above, humming faintly. Electricity, too, seemed endless here, feeding lights, radios, engines. He thought of blackouts in German cities, of candles burning low in cold rooms, of the silence that came when power failed. Here, there was no silence. One of the American guards spoke briefly to another, words too quick for the colonel to catch. Yet the tone was casual, even cheerful. They were not discussing shortages, not weighing rations, not debating what could be spared. They joked lightly, as men certain tomorrow would bring more of the same. The colonel shifted his stance, his boots pressing into gravel. The ground itself seemed stable in a way his homeland no longer felt. He remembered streets scarred by rubble, factories standing half-ruined, families waiting in long lines. He thought of men writing reports filled with numbers that no longer matched reality, reports designed to please leaders who demanded miracles. Here, no miracle was required, only trains, engines, steel fields, and time. He drew in a breath and let it out slowly. The hiss of steam was still there, fading but never gone, like a thread pulling him deeper into thought. He wondered, though he dared not say aloud, if he had seen this vision earlier, would he have believed? Would he have told his men the truth? Or was it only in defeat, in captivity, that the truth could enter uninvited? As the last of the train's cargo was stacked neatly, the yard settled into a quieter rhythm. The colonel's eyes drifted back to the rows of crates already standing. The train had added to them, but the difference seemed invisible, as though even this flood was swallowed by something greater. It was then that he heard a new sound, sharper and closer, the measured beat of boots striking the ground. He turned and saw a company of American soldiers marching past, rifles on their shoulders, uniforms crisp in the lantern light. The colonel straightened unconsciously, his spine stiff with old discipline. The sight of marching men stirred habits drilled into him since youth. Yet these men moved differently, not hurried, not desperate, but steady. Their faces were calm, their weapons new, their steps unbroken. He watched as they passed, the rhythm of boots blending with the last hiss of steam from the train, a rhythm that seemed to echo far beyond the yard. The sound lingered, unresolved, as though promising another revelation yet to come. The sound of boots striking the ground carried on long after the soldiers themselves had passed from sight. Each step seemed to echo across the yard, firm and unwavering, a rhythm so steady it felt as though the earth itself had learned their measure. The colonel's ears followed it until it faded into the night, and yet, even in silence, the cadence lingered. For him, it was not merely the tread of men, it was the sound of order, of confidence, of an army supplied without fear of running empty. It was the echo of a nation moving forward with an inexhaustible step. He found his gaze drawn again to the rifles they had carried, slung so casually across young shoulders. In Germany, rifles were objects of care, patched and repaired, passed from one soldier to another. Each weapon bore the scars of use, the marks of scarcity. Yet here, these American soldiers carried weapons that shone with fresh oil, unblemished and plentiful. They held them not with the reverence of scarcity, but with the ease of men who knew more awaited should one fail. That ease unsettled him more than the gleam itself. The colonel remembered the factories he had toured years before, long before shortages and bombings had thinned their output. He had once stood proudly among machinery stamping out weapons for the Reich. But even then, even at its peak, Germany's production had limits. A rifle was precious. a machine gun more so. And now, standing in this yard far from his homeland, he realized that what he saw was not the work of a few factories straining under pressure. It was the manifestation of something vaster, a continent turned into a single machine, its gears set to endless production. The memory of German speeches rose unbidden. Leaders had spoken of American laziness, of weakness, of a people too fond of comfort to endure hardship. He had repeated those words, believed them, even used them to harden his men. Yet the sight of rifles carried as casually as bread loaves cut through every phrase. Propaganda had drawn America as a fragile structure ready to collapse under its own weight. But what he saw here was no fragility. It was solidity, a foundation so broad and deep that no single blow could shatter it. The lantern light flickered across the stacked crates, shadows stretching like dark fingers. A thought pressed into his mind. If rifles were so abundant, then every item must be as well. Helmets, boots, belts, cartridges, all rolling off assembly lines, packaged, shipped, and distributed across oceans. He thought of Henry Ford, whose name he had heard often, even in Germany. Ford's factories had once built cars for ordinary people, affordable and identical, rolling endlessly from conveyor belts. Now that same method, magnified and multiplied, had been turned to war. Rifles, jeeps, bombers, products of the same philosophy of repetition, of efficiency. America had not only industry, but a way of thinking that made industry limitless. He closed his eyes and heard again the fading boots, the clink of rifles against belts. In the silence that followed, the colonel's mind returned to Germany's rail lines. He remembered the confusion after Allied bombs fell, timetables shredded, trains lost, signals darkened. He recalled officers struggling to account for missing shipments, papers smudged with rain, as men argued over where supplies had gone. He thought of fuel depots destroyed overnight, of food left to rot when transport failed. And now, across the ocean, he stood in a place where rifles gleamed, trains arrived without pause, soldiers marched with unbroken step. The colonel shifted, his boots grinding softly against gravel. His guard watched him with little more than mild interest. To the American soldier, this was routine. To the colonel, it was revelation. He remembered how German officers had been taught to measure logistics like lifeblood. Each drop counted. Yet here he stood in the middle of a flood so vast that counting seemed absurd. What use was calculation in the face of abundance? The night deepened. A faint breeze stirred, carrying the scent of oil and wood mingled with the sharper tang of steel. The colonel raised his head, and his eyes caught movement above. Against the dark sky, a plane traced a line of sound. Its engine rumbled low, steady, purposeful. It was no more than a single aircraft, likely on routine flight, but to the colonel it felt like a herald. He had heard engines roar in Germany, but too often now those roars ended in silence, machines falling from the sky, pilots never returning. This single plane overhead seemed not fragile but assured, as though part of a greater swarm waiting unseen. He followed the sound until it faded into distance. In its wake, silence returned, but silence here was never empty. It was filled with the weight of what he had seen. The rifles gleaming, the crates endless, the soldiers marching steady, the train that arrived without fail. Each detail pressed against his thoughts like stones building a wall, blocking the words of propaganda, blocking even his own pride. He felt as though he had stepped through a doorway into a truth that could not be ignored. Yet the colonel did not collapse into despair, not outwardly. His spine remained straight, his gaze steady. A man trained to command could not show weakness, not even in captivity. But within, the echo of boots and the glint of rifles gnawed quietly. The war, he realized, was not lost only on the battlefield. It was lost in the yards, the factories, the trains, the steady march of production that no speech could undo. As the last lanterns flickered against the rising night, the colonel let his eyes drift to the crates one final time. They stood in silence, but the silence was deceptive. Within each box was movement waiting to be released, rifles waiting to be fired, food waiting to be eaten, uniforms waiting to clothe new men. The stillness of the yard was an illusion. In truth, it was alive, pulsing, prepared. He thought of the young men with rifles on their shoulders, how easily they had carried what his soldiers guarded as treasure. He thought of the steady plane overhead, the train whose steam still lingered in the air, and then, faint but undeniable, another sound emerged from the distance. A low drone, heavy and layered, as though the sky itself carried weight. The colonel tilted his head. This was no single plane. This was a chorus, a gathering of engines beyond the horizon. The sound thickened the air, vibrating against his chest. He knew it at once. Bombers. Not a handful, not a squadron, but something larger. He stood very still, listening as the low drone grew closer. The low drone thickened as though the night itself had learned to hum. It was not the sharp cry of a single engine, not the sudden rush of a fighter plane darting across the horizon. This was deeper, heavier, layered upon itself until the sound seemed to come from every direction at once. The colonel lifted his eyes toward the sky, though in the darkness he could see only faint shadows moving like slow clouds. He did not need to see them to know what they were. Bombers. A formation large enough that even at altitude, even cloaked by night, their presence pressed down upon the earth like a heavy hand. The air trembled slightly, and the colonel felt the vibration in his chest. He remembered the first time he had heard such a sound over Germany, years before, when the war had still seemed new. Then, men had sworn that the Reich's air defenses would scatter them, that no bomb would fall without answer. He had believed it, as so many had believed, because belief was easier than fear. But the years had stripped that confidence bare. He had seen German cities burning, roofs collapsed, factories reduced to skeletons. He had stood in streets where fire still licked at the air, and men shoveled rubble instead of coal. Now, standing in an American yard, listening to the steady drone of bombers far from threat, he understood the imbalance fully. These planes did not fly as if in defiance of danger. They flew as though the sky belonged to them. The guards near him looked up briefly, some pausing in their conversation, but their faces held no anxiety. To them, this sound was not omen, but routine, as ordinary as the clatter of trains or the beat of marching boots. That indifference struck the colonel sharply once more. In Germany, every aircraft overhead brought a pause, a question. Would the bombs fall here? Would the sirens wail? But in this place, the sound of planes meant only another mission, another stream of machines feeding a war effort without fear of exhaustion. The colonel's gaze dropped again to the yard around him, the silent crates, the rows of rifles, the steady lantern light. He realized that what he heard above was not separate from what he saw below. The rifles, the food, the vehicles, the fuel, all of it rose into the sky as wings. Factories had not only built supplies for soldiers on the ground, but had filled the heavens with fleets that no enemy could rival. The ground and the sky were bound together by the same machine of industry. He thought of the Luftwaffe, once a pride of Germany, a symbol of speed and might. He remembered parades of sleek fighters glinting under sun, pilots saluted as knights of the air. But those knights had grown fewer. Fuel shortages grounded many. Spare parts vanished. Young men were sent to fly after only weeks of training, and too many never returned. Bombers that had once carried Germany's hopes now lay in twisted ruins across fields. In contrast, America's fleets grew like forests after rain, taller, thicker, spreading farther with each passing month. The hum above deepened, then softened as the bombers moved farther from the yard, their engines fading into distance. Silence followed, but it was no relief. It was the silence of recognition, the pause after truth had spoken plainly. The colonel drew a slow breath, his mind circling what he had heard. In the Reich, propaganda had spoken of American aircraft as clumsy, as inferior, as products of careless design. Yet above him had flown machines that did not stumble, that did not hesitate, that carried themselves as if born from abundance itself. He shifted his stance, and his boots pressed into the gravel with a faint crunch. In that sound he heard fragility, the brittleness of a ground that could be broken. Above, the bombers had been weight without weakness, rhythm without pause. He thought of the men who had built them, workers in factories across the United States, men and women, some who had never seen war firsthand, but whose hands shaped wings, engines, fuselages. Each bolt turned, each rivet driven was another link in a chain that reached across oceans. The colonel imagined those factories, vast halls filled with assembly lines, rows of machines humming, sparks flying, hands moving with practiced precision. He imagined shifts changing without pause, one worker stepping aside as another stepped in, the rhythm unbroken, the flow unending. The guards near him began to move again, shifting positions, checking rifles, speaking in low voices. The colonel's eyes lingered on those rifles once more, their shine caught faintly in the lantern light, polished steel reflecting the glow. It was not merely the presence of so many rifles that troubled him, but the knowledge that they were not unique, not special. They were identical, stamped from patterns, each one a twin of another. He thought of Henry Ford again, of assembly lines that had once built cars for families. Now, those same methods had multiplied rifles as easily as wheels, bombers as easily as engines. The colonel's breath grew shallow as he considered the weight of this realization. Germany's factories had once relied on skilled craftsmen, men whose hands shaped each piece with care. It gave pride to the product, but it slowed the flood. In contrast, America had traded craftsmanship for scale, individuality for multiplication. The result was visible in every crate, audible in every engine overhead. It was a philosophy as much as a practice. To build so much that scarcity itself vanished. He closed his eyes and remembered the last time he had inspected a German unit before his capture. Young soldiers stood with rifles of varying models, some decades old, patched together with makeshift parts. Their boots wore thin, their uniforms mismatched, their faces hollow from hunger. He had spoken to them of duty, of the honor of the fatherland, of courage. He had seen their eyes, weary but obedient, and he had repeated the words he had been taught. Yet now, as he thought of those faces, he saw the contrast too stark to ignore. American soldiers marched with rifles gleaming, boots firm, uniforms crisp. They laughed easily, ate well, carried their weapons not as fragile relics, but as tools given freely. The colonel's guard shifted again, glancing toward him as though expecting words. But he said nothing. Words, he felt, could not capture what weighed on him. Silence seemed truer. He turned his eyes upward once more, though the sky had grown empty again. No shadows moved now, no engines hummed, yet he felt them still, not as absence, but as promise. The bombers had passed, but others would follow. The rhythm would not end. Somewhere nearby, the faint clatter of metal drew his attention downward. A soldier had dropped a small tin of food, the can rolling briefly across gravel before it was retrieved. The colonel's eyes fixed on it, round, simple, marked with stenciled letters. The soldier tucked it into his pack as though it were nothing, a detail barely worth notice. Yet to the colonel it seemed as loud as the passing bombers. A single tin, one among thousands, carried with the same ease as rifles, as vehicles, as planes. It was another thread in the tapestry of abundance. His gaze lingered on the tin long after the soldier moved away. Food, too, flowed in unbroken streams, packaged, transported, consumed without fear of running out. The colonel thought of his own soldiers, their rations thin, their hunger hidden beneath discipline. He thought of the bitter substitutes brewed in German homes, the long lines of civilians waiting in silence. He thought of children who grew thinner with each passing month. And then, in his mind, he placed those children beside the casual motion of an American soldier tucking away a tin he would soon open without care. The colonel lowered his head, the image pressing hard against him. His own appetite faltered. It was not captivity that unsettled him most, but the sight of abundance so casual, so thoughtless, that it exposed the poverty of his homeland more cruelly than any prison bar could. And so, in the fading lantern light, with the sky above him once more silent, the colonel's eyes remained fixed on that simple memory of a tin of food resting in another man's hands. The memory of the small tin clung to him long after the soldier had tucked it away, its shape lingering in his thoughts like an unanswered question. It was not just food. It was a symbol of something greater, of streams that began far beyond this yard and flowed here in unbroken rivers. The colonel lowered his gaze to his own hands, weathered, marked by years of command, and wondered how many tins such hands had rationed, counted, and stretched until nothing remained. The image of that tin seemed louder than the passing bombers, louder even than the hiss of trains, for it carried with it the quiet weight of hunger remembered and hunger still to come. The sound of laughter carried across the yard. Young voices lifted in brief relief from duty. He turned toward it and saw the guards, still alert, yet untroubled, sharing a joke as they passed around another tin. One soldier tapped it playfully against his knee before pulling at the lid. The metal gave way with a soft snap, and a rich scent rose into the air. Meat, seasoned, packed, preserved, food not only for survival, but for strength. The smell reached the colonel and stirred something inside him. Not hunger, but recognition of what his own soldiers had lost. He thought of the men he had last commanded. Their rations had grown smaller with each passing month. Thin slices of bread, a smear of substitute spread, watery soup that filled bowls without filling stomachs. On the march, they carried what little they could, their packs lighter, not from design, but from absence. He had watched them chew slowly, trying to make each mouthful last. He had seen men lick crumbs from their hands as though nothing should be wasted. And now, in this American yard, tins were opened without hesitation, food eaten with laughter, waste unimagined. The colonel's thoughts stretched farther, across oceans to the fields he had read about, but never seen. America's land, vast and fertile, fields of wheat rippling like seas, corn rising tall, cattle grazing in numbers beyond reckoning. He pictured machines rolling across those fields, tractors and harvesters powered by fuel that flowed as freely as rivers. He had once prided himself on Germany's careful use of land, the discipline of farmers, the efficiency of production. But discipline was not abundance. No discipline could multiply soil or summon fuel from empty ground. What he saw in his mind's eye was not efficiency, but scale so immense it turned scarcity into a stranger. He closed his eyes and let the image take shape. Long trains of grain cars stretching to the horizon, silos filled to bursting, warehouses brimming with sacks of flour, ships carrying food across the Atlantic, their holds packed deep with wheat, canned goods, dried milk. Factories converting raw harvests into meals that could last months, packed into tins like the one he had just seen. From field to ship to soldier, the line was unbroken, each step fed by power Germany no longer possessed. The laughter from the guards faded, but the scent lingered, faint, yet undeniable. The colonel's appetite deserted him. Hunger had once driven him, sharpened his will, made him speak of sacrifice with conviction. But here, hunger dissolved not from satisfaction, but from the cruel awareness of what his nation could never match. He turned away from the guards and looked again at the stacked crates. How many held food? How many carried tins like the one just opened, each destined for another soldier who would eat without fear of tomorrow? He tried to imagine the numbers and failed. The mind, trained to count, faltered before such abundance. The colonel thought of children in Germany, thin hands holding bread too small for their hunger. He remembered letters from home, written in strained script, telling of long queues, of black bread that grew darker with each passing week, of coffee replaced with bitter roots. He had replied with words of reassurance, repeating official phrases of sacrifice and endurance. Yet as he stood in this yard, smelling meat from a tin opened as casually as a letter, he knew his words had been empty. No sacrifice could fill a void left by absence. No endurance could replace fields burned, transport shattered, or supplies cut off by blockades. One of the guards tossed the empty tin aside, its hollow clatter echoing briefly across the gravel. The sound struck the colonel like a hammer. An empty tin, discarded without care, was in Germany an object to be washed, reused, perhaps melted for metal, perhaps filled again with whatever scraps could be found. But here, it was nothing more than refuse. That casual gesture, that careless disposal, revealed more about America's strength than any speech could. To waste was to declare victory before the battle had even ended. The colonel straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. He felt the weight of revelation pressing harder, not in sudden bursts, but in steady waves. First the train, then the rifles, then the bombers, now the tin of food. Each piece was part of the same whole, each detail proof of a truth larger than any single image. America's strength was not only in weapons, not only in machines, but in the ability to feed its soldiers well, to give them confidence, to let them laugh at night instead of hunger gnawing at their bellies. It was a strength that reached beyond battlefields, woven into daily life, unbreakable because it was ordinary. The night air cooled as the guards resumed their watch. The colonel folded his arms, his mind circling the contrast. He thought of the Reich's claims that America was soft, its soldiers untested, its people spoiled by plenty. Yet standing here, surrounded by proof, he saw how wrong those claims had been. Plenty was not weakness. It was power, because it allowed men to fight without the weight of hunger, without fear of tomorrow. Plenty gave them strength, not only of body but of spirit. A faint hum rose in the distance, the sound of engines turning over, trucks preparing for another journey. The colonel lifted his head, listening. The hum grew into a steady rumble as headlights flickered to life, beams cutting across the yard. He realized the tins he had just seen opened, the rifles stacked in crates, the food unloaded from trains. All of it was not to remain here. It was to move again, carried by those trucks to the front, to the very men who would face his countrymen. Nothing here was static. Everything moved, flowed, fed into something larger. The rumble deepened as more engines started, the air filling with vibration. The colonel closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He had once commanded men to guard every drop of fuel, every ration of food, every bullet. He had watched trucks sit idle for lack of parts, for lack of petrol. He had seen supply lines collapse, leaving soldiers stranded. Now he heard engines starting in unison, not one or two, but many, enough to carry rivers of supplies forward without pause. The colonel opened his eyes again. The headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows against crates and gravel. Soldiers climbed into the trucks with easy motions, some laughing still, their bellies full, their packs heavy with food and ammunition. The rumble of engines blended with the fading laughter until the two became one rhythm, a sound of movement, of readiness. The colonel drew in a breath, slow and heavy. He understood that the war was not only about battles won or lost, not only about strategy or courage. It was about who could keep moving, who could keep feeding men, who could send not one truck, but hundreds, not one train, but thousands, not one tin, but millions. He felt the truth settle deeper than before. Germany, with all its discipline and all its sacrifice, could not match this. As the trucks began to roll forward, their tires crunching against gravel, the colonel's eyes followed them. Each headlight was like a small star moving into the distance, joining others until the horizon glowed faintly with lines of light. He stood motionless, watching them go, until the night was filled with the hum of engines carrying abundance into battle. The sound lingered, unresolved, as though asking a question only tomorrow could answer. The hum of engines filled the night, deep and layered, a chorus of pistons and gears joining in steady rhythm. The colonel stood still as the trucks began to move, their headlights glowing like beads of light strung across the dark. Tires crunched on gravel, then rolled onto the paved road beyond, the sound softening into a low, endless murmur. He followed them with his eyes until the first vehicles disappeared into shadow, but still, the line continued, one truck after another, as though the column would never end. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound was unlike the hurried rush of retreat, unlike the strained groan of overburdened convoys he had known in Germany. This was not desperation. It was rhythm, smooth and unhurried, as if each truck knew its place in a pattern larger than itself. They were not racing against shortages, not gambling against collapse. They were part of an order, an artery carrying life forward without fear of blockage. The colonel thought back to the last convoys he had seen under his own command. Trucks patched together with scraps, engines coughing, tires worn to threads, fuel rationed so tightly that men argued over each drop. Drivers sat tense, knowing Allied aircraft circled above, waiting to strike. Each convoy felt like a gamble, each journey a test of luck, more than planning. He remembered watching from the roadside as a column limped past, some vehicles towed by others, faces of men hollow with fatigue. It had been called logistics, but it was closer to desperation stitched together by hope. Now the contrast pressed against him like cold iron. These American trucks moved not with fear, but with confidence. Their engines did not sputter, but purred, steady and strong. Their drivers did not glance anxiously at the sky, but leaned back, chewing gum, chatting to one another through open windows. Even at night, they moved with the certainty of men who knew the road ahead was clear, that fuel would not run out, that the line behind them would not falter. The colonel's thoughts drifted farther, to whispers he had heard of an American supply line in France called the Red Ball Express. At first, he had dismissed it as rumor, or at most an exaggeration, another tale spread by nervous officers seeking excuse for defeat. But standing here, watching headlights stretch into the distance, he realized those whispers had carried truth. The Red Ball Express, thousands of trucks driving day and night, a ceaseless chain linking ports to front lines. He imagined roads choked with vehicles one after another, never stopping, never breaking. A stream of movement so constant it resembled the flow of a river, not the clumsy shuffle of men at war. He tried to picture what it meant in numbers. Each truck carrying supplies for hundreds of men, hundreds of trucks feeding divisions, thousands of trucks feeding entire armies. The thought grew until his mind recoiled. Germany's generals had often spoken of logistics as the backbone of war, but the colonel now saw that America had built not a backbone, but an entire body of movement, each truck a cell in a vast living organism. The air around him vibrated with their departure. He felt it in his boots, in his chest, in the gravel beneath his feet. The sound lingered even as the last of the headlights vanished beyond the ridge. He stood in silence then, broken only by the faint murmur of guards resettling themselves. Yet even in silence he could hear the movement continuing, far down the road, flowing into darkness like a current he could not see but knew was there. He thought of fuel, the lifeblood of those convoys. In Germany, fuel had become a shadow, promised but rarely delivered. Synthetic plants had been built, great experiments meant to create what nature had not given. But bombs had fallen, plants had burned, and barrels had grown scarce. Soldiers counted liters as though each were a coin of gold. Tanks stood idle, trucks abandoned, planes grounded. And here, across the ocean, trucks rolled as though rivers of fuel waited for them at every bend. He smelled it faintly in the air now. That sharp, heavy scent of gasoline carried by the breeze. For these men, it was no rarity. It was as ordinary as water. The colonel opened his eyes again, and the yard seemed quieter now, emptier without the line of trucks. But he knew it was only an illusion. The yard would fill again by morning. Another train arriving, another column ready to depart. The flow would not stop. It would not pause for shortage, nor stumble under bombing. It would continue until there was no road left to travel, until supplies reached Berlin itself, if need be. One of the guards near him shifted, adjusting his helmet, and muttered something about the long road ahead. The colonel did not understand every word, but the tone carried no dread. It was the fatigue of routine, not the fear of scarcity. The difference cut deeply. For his own soldiers, the road ahead had always meant uncertainty, hunger, danger. For these men, it meant work, but work carried out in the confidence that support stood endless behind them. He drew a slow breath and let it out, watching it plume faintly in the cool air. A question rose in his mind, one he did not speak aloud, but which pressed heavily against him. How had he ever believed otherwise? How had he listened to words that painted America as weak, as incapable of endurance, when the proof of its strength moved now before his very eyes? He felt the sting of shame, quiet but undeniable, that he had been so willing to believe lies when truth had always been larger than speeches. The gravel crunched again, faintly, as another truck rolled through the yard, smaller than the others, its headlights cutting briefly across the colonel's face. He blinked against the light, and when it passed, the darkness seemed deeper. He stood still, the echo of engines fading now into silence. Yet silence here was never empty. It was filled with the memory of what he had seen and heard. Trains arriving, crates stacked, rifles gleaming, bombers overhead, tins opened without care, and now trucks rolling into night without end. The colonel lowered his eyes, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He felt as though he had been walking through a corridor of revelations, each detail another door opening, each sound another step leading deeper into truth. And still, The corridor stretched on. He wondered where it would end, or if it would end at all. From beyond the ridge, faintly, a dog barked. The sound carried strangely in the night, sharp but distant. The colonel turned his head, listening. The bark repeated once, then twice more, before fading. It was a small sound, easily dismissed, but in the quiet yard it lingered. He thought of the guard dogs he had seen in German camps, thin from hunger, restless, barking at every shadow. The bark he heard now was different, steady, unhurried, more an announcement than a warning. The colonel stood in the cooling night, his ears tuned to that distant bark, and felt the weight of silence settle once more. Yet even as silence grew, the echo of engines remained within him, a hum he knew would not fade. The distant barking drifted into silence, but the echo of it clung faintly in the air, as if some hidden sentinel had marked the passage of the trucks. The colonel stood still, listening for it again, but only the cool night answered. In that quiet, he became aware of another sound, softer, closer, almost delicate against the weight of silence. Laughter, not loud or careless, but gentle, the kind that rises when men speak of simple things to one another. He turned slightly and saw a group of young American guards near the fence, their rifles leaning against their shoulders, their bodies relaxed in the glow of lantern light. They were speaking quietly, and every few moments one of them laughed, the sound low and unforced. The colonel let the sound wash over him. It was not the harsh laughter of men masking fear, nor the strained humor of soldiers trying to hide hunger. It was the laughter of youth unburdened, the laughter of men who ate well, who slept with full stomachs, who carried no thought of shortages pressing in upon them. He closed his eyes and saw instead the faces of the young men Germany had sent to the front in recent years. Boys, many of them no older than the guards before him, pulled from schools and farms, thrust into uniforms too large for their frames. Their faces had not carried laughter, but hollow eyes, thin cheeks, and the silent obedience of those who had little choice. The colonel remembered standing before such boys, his voice steady as he told them of duty, of destiny, of courage. He had spoken of sacrifice as if it were nourishment, a strength that would replace food and warmth. But looking at the Americans now, he realized what sacrifice had stolen from his own soldiers. It had stripped away their laughter, drained from them the small joys that gave spirit to the body. These guards, full-bellied and confident, laughed not because they were careless, but because they had the foundation of plenty. The colonel's gaze lingered on them. Their uniforms fit well, their boots thick and sturdy, their rifles gleaming with fresh oil. They did not fidget nervously, did not shift to ease hunger's ache, did not shiver in threadbare coats. They stood tall, speaking of things he could not hear, sharing moments of calm as though war itself were far away. He thought of his own men again, how they huddled close at night for warmth, how their laughter came only in fleeting bursts, quickly smothered by exhaustion. He recalled a letter he had once read from a mother to her son, a boy drafted too young. The letter had spoken of shortages, of how bread grew thinner and thinner, of how she prayed he might eat more at the front than she could provide at home. He had read it in silence, folded it back into the boy's hand, and told him to fight bravely. Now that letter rose again in his memory, placed against the sight of American guards sharing tins of meat as though food were air itself. The weight of that contrast pressed hard upon him. The colonel shifted his stance, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The guards did not notice. They laughed again, one clapping another on the shoulder, their voices steady, unbroken. It was the sound of strength expressed not in shouts, but in ease. He realized then that war was not won only with weapons or machines. It was won with the spirit of men who did not carry hunger or despair in their eyes. These soldiers were not hardened by scarcity, but they were not weak. Their confidence was the product of a nation that gave them everything they needed, and more besides. He thought of numbers, of manpower, of the sheer weight of populations. America's cities filled with millions, its fields supporting more, its industry pulling men from every corner. Even as hundreds of thousands went to fight, more remained to work, to build, to replace. Germany's strength, by contrast, had thinned. Each loss was felt like a wound that would not close. Each young man pulled from school left a classroom emptier. Each farmer drafted left fields untended. The Reich demanded sacrifice, but sacrifice drained the future even as it fought for the present. The colonel drew in a slow breath. The air smelled faintly of fuel from the departing trucks, mingled with the earthy scent of the yard. He thought of how that air would smell in Germany. Smoke from ruins, dust from collapsed walls, the acrid stench of shortages that never left. He thought of the boys who stood where men should have stood, their eyes sunken, their uniforms hanging loosely. He felt again the ache of memory. Boys standing in line, rifles mismatched, rations thin, their laughter gone. The American guards shifted, their laughter softening as they settled back into position. One leaned against the fence, humming a tune low in his throat. The colonel tilted his head, listening. The melody was unfamiliar, but its tone was light, easy, born not of longing, but of contentment. He realized with a pang that he could not remember the last time he had heard one of his soldiers hum. War had silenced such sounds in Germany long ago. The colonel's hands tightened behind his back, though his face remained calm. He felt the revelation settle deeper. Abundance did not only fill crates or power engines, it filled men's hearts. It gave them the ease to laugh, the freedom to hum, the strength to carry rifles without dread. Scarcity had stripped those things from Germany's soldiers, leaving them with discipline alone. But discipline without joy was brittle. It bent under pressure until it snapped. The night deepened. A faint hum rose again from the road, the echo of trucks still moving, carrying supplies farther into the dark. The colonel listened, the sound merging with the faint laughter of the guards. Together they wove a picture of strength he could not deny. He thought again of the question that had haunted him earlier. How could he have believed otherwise? How had he convinced himself that a nation of plenty was a nation of weakness? The answer did not come, only silence. He closed his eyes and saw faces once more. Boys in two large helmets, men grown thin, children at home waiting for bread. He heard again their silence, the absence of laughter, the heaviness in their voices. He opened his eyes, and before him stood young Americans, laughing quietly under lantern light, rifles polished, bellies full. The contrast was no longer just thought. It was proof written in flesh and spirit. From somewhere beyond the yard, a new sound drifted in. Low at first, then clearer. Engines, many of them, starting in unison, their growl rising together like a tide. The colonel turned his head toward the sound. Trucks, again, preparing for another departure, perhaps larger than the last. The laughter of the guards faded as they adjusted their stances, ready for the movement to begin. The colonel felt the rhythm of engines build, a hum that filled the night, steady and unbroken. The laughter lingered faintly in his ears, even as the hum grew stronger. It seemed to carry into the engines themselves, a spirit woven into steel and fuel. The colonel stood motionless, the sound pressing into him, unresolved yet undeniable, carrying him toward another revelation. The hum of engines swelled until it seemed to fill the very air, a sound so constant it blurred into the night like the low rushing of a distant sea. The colonel lifted his head slightly, listening as one growl joined another, then another still, until the vibration pressed into his chest and settled in his bones. He knew the sound well, the readiness of convoys preparing to move. But here it was different. It carried no strain, no hesitation, no sense of shortage balanced on the edge of collapse. It was the sound of confidence, of machines fueled without fear, of motion made inevitable by abundance. Headlights flickered alive one by one, beams cutting sharp through the dark. They stretched across the yard like stars fallen to earth, aligning themselves into lines of order. Soldiers climbed into seats, voices low, movements unhurried. There was no chaos, no scramble. The rhythm of departure unfolded with the precision of a ceremony repeated too many times to falter. The colonel closed his eyes and remembered the convoys of Germany. How many times had he stood on a roadside, waiting for trucks that arrived late or did not arrive at all? How many times had he watched drivers patch tires with scraps of canvas, pour the last drops of fuel into tanks while praying for the next station? He recalled the faces of men weary from nights without sleep, their nerves frayed by the knowledge that Allied planes hunted them from above. He saw again the long gaps in columns where trucks should have been, the silence of engines that never started. He had called it improvisation, necessity, sacrifice, but compared to what he saw here, it had been collapse disguised by words. The trucks in the American yard began to roll forward, one after another, headlights stretching like a chain of light into the road beyond. The colonel's eyes followed them as they moved with ease, their engines steady, their loads heavy, yet untroubled. Each carried crates, fuel, food, weapons, the very veins and arteries of an army in motion. He realized now that it was not only the battlefield where wars were decided, it was here, in the endless hum of engines carrying supplies forward without pause. He thought again of the whispers he had heard of the Red Ball Express. At the time, he had laughed quietly, dismissing it as another Allied boast. But now, watching headlights snake into the distance, he knew it had been truth. Thousands of trucks, he imagined, each running day and night, each carrying what soldiers needed to fight another hour, another day, another month. He saw in his mind roads choked with convoys so dense they seemed rivers of steel and light, flowing from ports to battlefields without interruption. The colonel shifted his stance, gravel crunching beneath his boots. He felt the weight of realization deepen. Germany had lost not only battles, not only cities, but the power to move. Fuel was gone, rails shattered, roads bombed, armies starved not only for food, but for movement itself, their bodies heavy, their machines idle. Motion had become luxury. Here, in this American yard, motion was ordinary, expected, repeated again and again without end. The engines roared louder as more trucks joined the column. He smelled the sharp tang of exhaust in the air, mingled with the faint scent of oil and dust. The sound grew until it became almost hypnotic, a deep current pulling his thoughts with it. He wondered, as he stood there, how many such convoys moved this very night. How many roads across this vast continent carried the same sound? How many ships upon the ocean fed these trucks with their endless cargo? He realized with a shiver that no calculation could capture it. It was too vast, too constant, too sure. The guards around him shifted, their rifles glinting faintly in the beams of headlights. They watched the trucks depart with the same calm indifference they had shown to trains, to bombers, to crates of rifles. For them, this was no marvel. It was the expected rhythm of war fought with certainty. The colonel felt again that sting, the sting of realizing that what seemed miracle to him was routine to them. That difference, more than anything else, revealed the truth. He thought of the words he had repeated so often, that Germany's strength lay in spirit, in discipline, in sacrifice. But spirit could not move trucks without fuel. Discipline could not replace tires worn to threads. Sacrifice could not refill engines running dry. He had spoken those words to men who believed him, to boys who clutched rifles as though belief itself could shield them. And yet here, in the steady hum of American engines, belief was nothing beside abundance. The convoy lengthened, headlights stretching farther into the dark until they resembled a ribbon of stars pulled taut across the earth. The colonel's eyes followed it, his breath shallow. He realized with sudden clarity that Germany could never build such a ribbon. Its light had already dimmed, its fuel already gone, its engines silenced by shortages that could not be undone. The contrast was unbearable, yet undeniable. One of the guards nearby muttered something to another, a jest about the long road, and both chuckled softly. The colonel heard their laughter mingling with the engines, as though the spirit of ease itself flowed into the convoys. He thought again of his own men, how silence had followed them, how fear had marked their faces, how laughter had disappeared like fuel itself. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he saw those boys again, standing beside trucks that would never start, waiting for supplies that would never come. He opened his eyes, and the headlights of American trucks still glowed, steady, unbroken. The colonel felt a whisper rise in his mind, one he had not spoken aloud, but which pressed heavily against him. How could we ever have believed otherwise? The question lingered, silent yet insistent, as though the engines themselves demanded an answer. He had no reply. The convoy continued into the distance, its sound fading slowly, the air still trembling faintly with its passage. The colonel remained where he was, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the road now empty of light. Silence returned, but silence here was never empty. It carried the weight of what had passed, the memory of movement so vast it seemed eternal. From somewhere beyond the yard, faint and ghost-like, came another sound, the rustle of paper against gravel, a soft flutter carried by the night breeze. The colonel turned his head and saw a scrap of newspaper tumbling across the ground, its edges catching the lantern glow. It slid against a crate, then lifted again, its print visible for a brief instant in the light. Headlines, photographs, bold letters that spoke of advances, victories, progress. The colonel's eyes fixed on the drifting paper, his thoughts pulled sharply toward it. For in those headlines, he knew, lay another truth, another revelation waiting to unfold. The newspaper rustled again, caught in the cool breath of wind, its edges folding and unfolding as if it were alive. The colonel watched it drift across the gravel, its faint movements punctuated by the flutter of paper against stone. It skidded briefly against the side of a crate before lifting once more, sliding closer until the lantern light revealed fragments of ink. He saw a headline in bold type, half obscured by creases, the English words unfamiliar, yet recognizable in shape and rhythm. There were photographs too, blurred in the shifting light, soldiers advancing, machines crossing bridges, flags raised where once only ruins stood. He crouched slightly, his hands still bound loosely at the wrists, and stared at the page. He could not read all of it, but the message was clear, even in fragments. Progress, advance, victory. The photographs told the rest. Columns of Allied troops marching through liberated towns, smiling civilians waving from windows, armored vehicles pressing forward on roads where his own soldiers had once stood. The images burned quietly into his mind. He did not need words to understand them. A guard noticed his gaze and bent briefly to pick up the paper. He smoothed it out with casual hands, glanced at the headlines, and gave a small chuckle before tossing it back down. For the American, it was nothing more than news already known, a confirmation of what was expected. For the colonel, it was revelation written in ink. He thought of the papers in Germany, how they clung to the language of victory long after defeats had become undeniable. He remembered reading headlines that spoke of breakthroughs, counterattacks, new weapons that would turn the tide. He had read them in rooms that smelled of smoke and fatigue, surrounded by officers who pretended to believe. Each headline had been another thread in a fabric of illusion. The paper at his feet seemed now like a mirror held up to that illusion. Its photographs, its headlines, its very presence contradicted the words he had once spoken with conviction. America weak? Britain exhausted? The Allies divided? Each claim now fell apart under the weight of photographs showing otherwise. He stared at the smiling faces of civilians in the images, their joy unmistakable, their relief like sunlight breaking through clouds. He thought of German cities instead, their people not smiling but standing in long queues for bread, their homes reduced to rubble, their children coughing in the cold. He reached out slightly, almost instinctively as if to touch the paper, but stopped short when the guard's eyes met his. He withdrew his hand and straightened again, his face calm, though his chest ached with the realization pressing deeper. The propaganda he had repeated for years dissolved under the weight of this single page. A scrap of paper drifting on the wind spoke louder than speeches shouted in great halls. The colonel's mind wandered back to the rallies he had attended, the thunder of voices raised in unison, the banners unfurled, the speeches swelling with certainty. He had stood there, uniform pressed, medals gleaming, his heart beating with conviction that Germany would endure, that destiny itself favored them. He remembered the faces of those around him, flushed with belief, eyes wide with fervor. Those memories rose now like ghosts, brittle and insubstantial against the paper at his feet. Belief had been strong, but it had been belief alone. Against abundance, against industry, against the sheer weight of Allied power, belief had no strength at all. The breeze lifted again, and the newspaper fluttered a few steps farther, tumbling until it came to rest against the colonel's boot. He did not move. He stared down at it, the print sharp in the glow of lanterns. A photograph showed American tanks, dozens of them, moving in a line that stretched toward the horizon. He could almost hear the rumble in his imagination, the weight of treads crushing stone, the steady advance that photographs alone could not silence. He thought of the promises of Germany's new weapons, of miracle solutions whispered in meetings and spread in speeches. Yet, what miracle could stand against such images? A tank was not miracle. It was machine, multiplied endlessly until numbers themselves became destiny. The colonel's chest tightened, his breath shallow. He thought of his men again, the boys he had led, their rifles patched, their uniforms worn thin. He thought of the words he had told them, that America was weak, that supplies would run out, that spirit would triumph. And here, in a prison yard, he saw the proof that every word had been false. The shame of it pressed against him more heavily than the chains at his wrists. The guards spoke softly among themselves, their voices calm, unhurried. One of them nudged the paper farther with his boot, sending it tumbling again into the darkness beyond the crates. The colonel's eyes followed it until it disappeared, but the images remained in his mind. They would not drift away. They would stay, sharper than any speech, clearer than any report. He thought again of the question that had risen earlier. How could we have believed otherwise? The paper gave the answer, though it was bitter. They had believed because it was easier. They had believed because to doubt was to weaken. They had believed because propaganda filled the silence where truth should have spoken. But belief had ended here, in a yard filled with crates, under a sky where bombers flew, on a night when trucks rolled without pause. The colonel turned his face slightly toward the guards. Their ease, their laughter, their casual glances at newspapers that confirmed victories. They spoke of men who no longer questioned outcome. The war's end was written not only in battles fought, but in the quiet certainty of soldiers who already felt it won. He closed his eyes briefly and felt the weight of inevitability pressing in. Germany's defeat was not approaching. It had already arrived. The night air cooled further, and a faint rustle of leaves stirred beyond the yard. The colonel stood in silence, his thoughts circling the images from the paper, the smiles, the tanks, the columns of soldiers. He wondered how many more such headlines had been printed, how many photographs filled American homes, how many truths spread openly where in Germany only illusion was allowed. He wondered if those at home in his own country still believed, or if the crumbling of faith had already begun. A lantern flickered, casting shadows long against the ground. In the shifting light, the colonel saw his own shadow stretch thin, bent against the crates. He thought of all the shadows cast by propaganda, tall and looming, yet without substance. Now the shadow seemed fragile, insubstantial compared to the weight of images burned into his mind. The guards settled again into silence. One leaned back against a crate, the faint creak of wood carrying in the stillness. Another lit a cigarette, the spark briefly flaring before smoke curled upward. The colonel breathed in faint traces of tobacco, mixed with the heavier scent of oil and exhaust still hanging in the air. He let the smoke drift past him, its shape fading quickly into night. Like the illusions he had once believed, it disappeared before his eyes, leaving only the truth that could not be banished. Somewhere beyond the yard, a train whistle sounded, low and mournful, drifting across the distance. The colonel lifted his head, listening. The sound carried him back to the earlier vision of crates and engines, of abundance arriving without end. The whistle lingered, unresolved, and with it rose another question in his mind, one he did not yet know how to answer. The low whistle of the train stretched out across the night, long and mournful, as though the iron itself carried a memory of all the burdens it bore. The colonel lifted his head and listened, his breath caught in the sound. It was not only a signal of arrival or departure, not only the ordinary cry of metal on rails. It was something older, a voice that spoke of distance, of journeys continuing when others had already ended. He felt the sound in his chest, hollow and steady, as though the whistle had been meant for him alone. The memory of the drifting newspaper rose again, its headlines, its blurred images of advancing columns. He thought of Normandy, though he had not been there himself. Reports had come to him months before, clipped and cautious, speaking first of a raid, then of a landing, then of something larger, more permanent. At first, he had believed the words of superiors who insisted it was containable, a breach that would be sealed. But the breach had widened, and the words had faltered. The photographs he had glimpsed in that paper told the rest. The Allies had not been stopped. They had come ashore with such force that even the strongest defenses had bent, and from that shore they had poured inland as unbroken as the train whistles echoing tonight. He remembered the faces of fellow officers when the first news had spread. Some spoke bravely, insisting counterattacks would succeed. Others sat silent, their eyes fixed on maps as if the lines themselves could not be trusted. The colonel had repeated the official phrases, that reinforcements were coming, that defenses would hold, that the Reich had endured worse and would endure again. Yet even then he had felt a shadow of doubt. The shadow grew each week as reports of Allied advances lengthened. Cities once marked as safe zones fell, bridges were lost, roads were cut. The line moved ever backward. Now, hearing the whistle of trains bringing new supplies to the yard, the colonel saw how that advance had been possible. It was not courage alone, nor strategy alone. It was this: crates stacked high, rifles polished and plentiful, bombers above, convoys below, food flowing in tins, trucks rolling into night. The landing at Normandy had not been miracle. It had been preparation, the culmination of factories, fields, and rails that had turned across an ocean toward Europe. What his leaders had called impossible had been inevitable. The lantern light flickered again, shadows wavering. The colonel thought of the photographs of civilians cheering in liberated towns. Their faces had been thin, marked by years of occupation, but their smiles were wide. He thought of German civilians instead, their faces downcast, their cities reduced to rubble by firestorms. The contrast gnawed at him. Once, propaganda had promised that Germany's occupation would bring order, prosperity, unity. But the photographs showed otherwise. Joy returned not when the Reich advanced, but when it retreated. He let out a slow breath and remembered the bitter winter of the Eastern Front, years before. Men had frozen, starved, fought until their bodies gave way. Supplies had failed. Reinforcements had not come. He had been told then that sacrifices would be rewarded, that destiny required suffering, that a final victory would redeem all loss. He had believed because he had no choice but to believe. Yet here, in the hum of trucks, in the whistle of trains, in the easy laughter of guards, he saw that victory did not rest in destiny. It rested in crates, in fuel, in fields of wheat, in machines that rolled off assembly lines day and night. The guard with the cigarette exhaled another thin curl of smoke. The colonel watched it twist into the cool air, fragile and brief. It reminded him of the Reich itself. Vast and loud in its beginning, but already fading, its substance lost, its promises disappearing like smoke carried away by wind. He thought of speeches that had claimed the Reich would last 1,000 years. 10 years had not yet passed, and already the end was written in silence, in hunger, in photographs carried across oceans. The whistle echoed again, this time from farther away, softer, fading into distance. The colonel closed his eyes and let the sound blend with memory. He saw maps unrolled across tables, arrows drawn with certainty, voices raised in command. He saw those same maps torn, redrawn, patched, the arrows retreating with each report. He saw fellow officers grow gaunt, their eyes haunted, their voices less firm. He saw promises written in reports, promises made not to inform, but to soothe leaders who demanded victories where none existed. And above all, he saw the faces of the soldiers sent into those retreats, their bodies worn, their spirits dimmed, their laughter gone. A gust of wind stirred, carrying the faint smell of oil and smoke. The colonel's eyes opened again. The yard stood quiet now, save for the guards and the dim glow of lanterns. But in his mind it was filled still with movement, with trains and trucks, with soldiers advancing in photographs, with tanks pressing forward. He felt the inevitability of it, the knowledge that what had begun in Normandy had not stopped, would not stop, could not stop. It was a tide, and tides did not retreat because a man commanded them to. He turned slightly, his gaze settling on the horizon beyond the fence. He imagined the front lines, the villages where German soldiers now dug in, the roads where they waited for supplies that would not come. He pictured those lines bending again, pushed back as headlights advanced, as crates were emptied, as bombers passed overhead. He felt the truth settle heavily upon him. The war was already decided. The men at the front might still fight, but they fought not for victory, only for time. The colonel's breath slowed. The paper's images still lingered in his mind. tanks stretching into distance, soldiers marching steady, civilians smiling through tears. He wondered how many such images were printed each day, how many were read in American homes, how many spread across Allied cities. He wondered if the people of Germany still believed the headlines given to them, or if doubt had already crept into their kitchens, their shelters, their long lines for bread. The cigarette glow dimmed, then flared once more as the guard drew in a breath. Smoke curled upward again, and the colonel watched it fade. He thought of his homeland fading in the same way, not with sudden collapse, but with slow, steady dissipation, each gust of wind carrying away another fragment until nothing remained but the memory of something that had once seemed unshakable. A new sound stirred then, soft but clear, the rustle of the discarded newspaper being caught again by the wind, sliding across gravel, lifting briefly into the air before vanishing into the dark. The colonel's eyes followed it until it disappeared, but the images remained, sharper than before. The rustle faded, unresolved, leaving only silence and the faint thrum of memory. And from that silence, another presence entered, a faint crackle of music, so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind drifted from the direction of the guard post. The colonel tilted his head, listening. It was a radio, the tune almost lost in static, carrying notes across the night like whispers from another world. The faint music drifted through the stillness, carried on threads of static, fragile yet persistent. The colonel turned his head slightly, listening. At first it was no more than a murmur, notes dissolving into the crackle of interference. But then the melody grew clearer, a tune simple and light, almost cheerful. It seemed out of place in the heavy quiet of the yard, yet it spread gently, weaving itself into the night air until it felt as natural as the glow of the lanterns. One of the guards leaned against the post where the radio sat, his helmet tilted back slightly, his face calm. He tapped his finger softly against his rifle in time with the music. Another guard smiled faintly, shaking his head at the tune but not silencing it. The colonel watched them with careful eyes, and he felt again that contrast that had haunted him all night. These men, young and far from home, could listen to music without fear. For them, the war did not steal every sound, did not silence every joy. The melody reminded the colonel of evenings long ago before the war, when radios had been common in German homes. He remembered his own house, his wife turning the dial until music filled the room. He remembered the warmth of those moments, simple and unbroken. But as the war deepened, music had given way to voices, propaganda, speeches, announcements of victories that never seemed to end. The radio became less a comfort and more a command. The Reich's words filled every home, every ear, until silence itself was preferable. Music had been pushed aside by rhetoric, and the people had listened because they were told to. Now, in the hands of young American guards, the radio was not command, but companion. It carried not orders, but songs. The colonel listened closely, and though he could not understand the English words, the tone was unmistakable, optimistic, steady, free of despair. He imagined how many homes across the United States were filled with the same sound. Families gathered around radios listening to music, to voices of encouragement, to news of progress. The war for them was burden, but it was also unity. Each citizen, each worker, each soldier seemed bound by shared effort rather than fear. He thought of bond drives, of posters he had glimpsed in captured towns, smiling faces, slogans urging citizens to give, to build, to support. He thought of the factories he had imagined, filled with men and women working shifts without pause, their labor framed not as suffering, but as contribution. In Germany, work had been demanded through fear. Production had been driven by punishment, by decrees, by the ever-present threat of failure. But in America, he sensed, it had been called a duty embraced, a pride willingly carried. The difference was subtle, yet immense. Fear built quickly, but crumbled just as fast. Pride endured. The colonel closed his eyes, letting the music settle deeper. The tune carried an ease that felt almost impossible to him. He thought of German rallies where music had been loud and orchestrated, overwhelming, designed to command emotion. This tune was nothing like that. It was simple, a melody for evenings, for moments of rest. It did not command. It comforted. He wondered what it meant to fight a war with such comfort still present, to face hardship without losing the small joys of daily life. The guards near the radio spoke softly, one of them humming along, the others listening with half smiles. The colonel saw in them a spirit that could not be faked. It was not the forced fervor of rallies, not the brittle determination of men convinced by fear. It was something steadier, quieter, rooted in a nation that had given its people more than illusions. He realized then that spirit was as vital as weapons or fuel. A soldier who believed his home was secure, who knew his family was fed, who felt his nation behind him not with fear, but with pride. Such a soldier carried a strength no propaganda could replicate. The colonel's thoughts returned to his own people, to the silence of German cities at night. Radios there carried speeches that grew shorter, sharper, more desperate. Promises of victory came with greater urgency, as though words alone could reverse tides. Music, when it was heard at all, felt hollow, a thin mask over despair. Families huddled in basements during raids, listening not for tunes, but for the whistle of bombs. Children asked questions that mothers could not answer. Fear, not unity, had become the thread tying them together. The melody from the guard's radio rose briefly, then softened, fading into static before returning again. The colonel felt a strange ache in his chest. It was not nostalgia alone, but something more, a recognition that war could be endured differently. For the Americans, the war was fought with factories, with trucks, with bombers. Yes, but it was also fought with songs, with laughter, with the ordinary strength of people who believed in tomorrow. The cigarette in the guard's hand glowed faintly again, the ember bright in the dark. Smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of tobacco. The colonel inhaled faintly, the smell mingling with oil, dust, and the softer notes of music. He thought of how war in Germany smelled instead: rubble, smoke, damp stone, hunger. The difference was not only in numbers or machines, but in the air itself, in the way life persisted or disappeared. He shifted his weight, gravel crunching underfoot. The guards paid him little attention now, their focus turned toward the music. He realized with a small pang that they did not fear him, did not even see him as threat. He was a prisoner, yes, but in their eyes, he was already part of a war decided. Their ease around him was not negligence, it was certainty. The colonel lowered his gaze, his mind circling the revelation again. Germany had tried to command belief through fear, but fear was brittle. America had inspired belief through abundance, through unity, through simple songs played on radios in the night. That difference was not decoration, it was the root of strength. The tune shifted, a new song rising through the static, its rhythm livelier now, its tone brighter. The colonel did not know the melody, but he felt its meaning. It spoke not of despair, but of continuation, of endurance, of joy kept alive even in darkness. He thought of his homeland, and for the first time he understood fully that its silence was not strength, but weakness. The guards adjusted their rifles as the music played on, one of them humming more loudly now. The colonel closed his eyes again, letting the sound carry him deeper into reflection. He wondered how many such radios played across the ocean tonight, in homes, in factories, in barracks. He wondered how many people heard the same tune and felt the same certainty. He realized then that this was part of the war too, invisible yet decisive. The song faded into static once more, then grew quiet. The guard tapped the radio, adjusting the dial. Another voice crackled through, low and distant. Words the colonel could not follow. Then music returned, softer this time, almost a lullaby. The colonel felt his eyes grow heavy, not with sleep, but with the weight of recognition. Germany had been fighting not only armies, but entire nations bound together by songs, by pride, by faith in tomorrow. It had never been a fair contest. From the shadows at the edge of the yard, the wind rose again, rustling leaves, carrying the faint scent of earth. The colonel listened, the music blending with the whisper of wind, unresolved yet steady. He opened his eyes and looked once more at the guards, their faces calm, their spirits unbroken. The radio glowed faintly in the lantern light, a small beacon against the night. And as the song lingered in the air, he realized that sometimes the strength of a nation was not measured in rifles or tanks, but in the quiet persistence of music that would not be silenced. The melody softened, unresolved, leaving him with a final question. If even songs could carry such power, what hope remained for those who had only fear? The radio's song thinned into silence, the last notes dissolving into static before vanishing altogether. The colonel kept his eyes on the faint glow of the dial, though nothing more came from it. The stillness that followed seemed heavier than before, as if the absence of music had made the night itself pause. He drew a slow breath, and the cool air filled his chest with a weight that was not only of the present, but of everything he had come to understand. The guards settled back into their posts. One shifted against a crate, another leaned on his rifle. Their movements were quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. Yet in their ease, the colonel saw the same certainty that had filled every sound of the night. The hiss of trains, the echo of marching boots, the hum of trucks, the drone of bombers, the laughter of young soldiers, the music of the radio. All had spoken the same truth, that America's strength was not an illusion, but a reality so immense it could not be denied. He thought of his capture, of the days that had led him here. When he had surrendered, a part of him had still clung to belief in words repeated too many times to be questioned, belief in miracle weapons, in divisions gathering strength unseen, in tides that could yet turn. But each hour in captivity had chipped away at that belief, not through cruelty, not through interrogation, but through the quiet force of abundance. The truth had not been shouted at him. It had revealed itself in boxes stacked higher than he could count, in engines that never faltered, in soldiers who laughed without fear. He lifted his eyes toward the night sky. It stretched dark and endless, but he knew that above it, fleets of planes moved even now, their engines steady, their holds filled with bombs that would fall on his homeland. He thought of the ground beneath his boots, solid and stable, filled with fuel and steel that would feed armies moving east. He thought of the people across the ocean, farmers harvesting in fields so wide they dwarfed entire countries, workers filling factories with unbroken rhythm, families listening to radios that carried not fear, but resolve. The war, he realized, was not only fought on battlefields. It was carried in every furrow of land, every bolt turned in a factory, every song played at night. The colonel lowered his gaze and looked at his hands. They were steady still, though he felt the tremor within. These hands had signed orders, had drawn lines on maps, had held the weight of command. They had pointed men toward battles that now seemed futile. He wondered if they had ever truly commanded anything at all, or if they had only moved within illusions spun by leaders who demanded belief over truth. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, feeling the roughness of skin worn by years of service. For the first time, he admitted to himself that the greatest battle had already been lost before he ever stood in this yard. A breeze stirred again, carrying the faint scent of oil and earth. It brushed against the lantern flames, making them flicker. In that wavering light, the colonel's shadow stretched long across the gravel, thin and fragile against the solid shapes of crates and trucks. He watched it move, bending and shifting with the flame. It seemed to him then that Germany itself was like the shadow, large in shape, commanding at first glance, but without substance compared to the solid weight of supplies, machines, and spirit that stood behind the Allies. He let his eyes close, listening to the night. In the silence, he could still hear echoes, the march of boots, the hum of engines, the laughter of guards, the faint music fading into static. Each sound was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of inevitability. He felt himself drawn into that pattern, no longer resisting, no longer denying. His pride still lived, but pride alone could not silence truth. The colonel thought of home, of the faces of his family. He wondered what they believed now, what they were told each day, what they still hoped for. He wished he could speak to them honestly, to tell them that the war was not to be won, that sacrifice had reached its end, that the future would not be forged by more speeches or more promises. He wished he could tell them that defeat was not dishonor, but recognition of reality. Yet he knew his words would never reach them. They were trapped still in a world of illusion, waiting for headlines that no longer mattered. The guards shifted again. One of them stretched, his boots scraping against the ground. Another murmured something about the morning to come. Their voices were low, steady, filled with the ease of men who expected tomorrow to arrive without disruption. The colonel envied that ease, though he did not resent it. In a way, it comforted him. It told him that war, though terrible, could be carried without destroying spirit. It told him that nations could fight not only with weapons, but with faith in simple things: food, music, laughter, youth. He opened his eyes once more. The lantern light cast its steady glow, and beyond the fence the horizon lay dark, waiting for dawn. He knew that when the sun rose, trains would arrive again, trucks would depart again, bombers would fly again. The rhythm would continue, unbroken. Germany could not match it, could not even slow it. The war had been lost not in a single battle, not in a single decision, but in the quiet, relentless weight of abundance. The colonel straightened slightly, his posture still disciplined, though his thoughts had shifted. He no longer resisted the truth. He accepted it, not with despair, but with clarity. Defeat was inevitable, and he had seen it not in the clash of armies, but in the silence of a yard filled with crates, in the hum of engines, in the laughter of guards who carried no fear. A faint static rose again from the radio, then disappeared. The colonel's eyes lingered on it, and he thought of the songs that had played earlier. Their echoes remained in him, blending with all the other sounds of the night. He realized then that the war's end was not only written in headlines or measured in battles. It was already alive in the spirit of a nation that had never doubted itself, that had fed its soldiers, clothed them, armed them, given them music to carry into the dark. The colonel lowered his head, his eyes closing once more. He let the silence surround him, heavy but not empty. In that silence he found the final truth, that sometimes the end of a war is not seen in fire or ruin, but in the quiet recognition of one man who finally sees clearly. He did not need to speak it aloud. It was written in the night itself, in the unbroken rhythm of abundance. The lanterns burned softly, the guards kept their steady watch, and the horizon waited in silence for the coming of dawn.